Hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to come along to talk about responding to modern slavery. Just a little bit about me. At the moment, I'm the executive manager of the Anti-Slavery Task Force in the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney. That's my boss there in the red hat, Archbishop Anthony Fisher. And just to give a little bit of background, because I've only been there for about 10 months, and many of you know me from my previous role at the Salvation Army, where I established and operated Australia's only safe house for victims of human trafficking and slavery. And I did that for about 10 years, and then with a generous gift from Andrew Forrest, was able to set up the Freedom Partnership to End Modern Slavery. And we've worked with many of you in the room. But I've been at the Anti-Slavery Task Force for the last 10 months, and before I joined, Archbishop Fisher, kind of in response to Pope Francis's call to action on human trafficking and slavery around the world, announced that he was going to set up the task force to deliver a program to eradicate modern slavery from the archdiocesan supply chains. So that mandate predates the Modern Slavery Act to about 2017. And if you think about that statement, it's a pretty huge commitment, I think, from the Archbishop. And what that means in the Archdiocese, and if you think about what are Catholic supply chains, what do they look like? Sydney Catholic Schools is 152 schools. Does anybody have kids at Catholic school? Okay. Catholic Schools, New South Wales, those are the independent schools, and there's about 22 of them. The Catholic Development Fund of Sydney, which is not a bank, but kind of similar to a bank, has over $1 billion of assets in it, invested here and there. Catholic Care, community service program, and aged care services in the diocese. So we're talking about billions of dollars held just in the Archdiocese of Sydney. How many dioceses are there in Australia? Can anyone guess? 33. And they all have similar entities. And they're all over $100 million. So we have collectively, the Catholic Church in Australia is the 4th largest procurer of goods and services in the country. Now, I say collectively, we aren't collective. It is a very kind of fragmented system. But if you think about what's not on that list, healthcare, aged care across the country, universities, insurance, superannuation funds, cemeteries, and these are all entities that have to report. So we think there's about 40 to 50 entities. Actually haven't found them all yet. It's interesting. So if you go on ABN, look up, and you type in the word Catholic, you'll come up with about 6,500 organizations just with that word. So anyway, it's massive, right? The footprint is huge. And where does a lot of this money come from? Anyone, can you guess? Public money. It's taxpayer dollars, right? So obviously hugely important for the Catholic Church to be accountable in terms of modern slavery, and the Modern Slavery Act captures us. And this is unique, actually. Other legislation around the world doesn't. So I think this is such an important strength of the legislation when you consider, again, the amount of spend in the Catholic Church across the country. So, our little team of 3 has this mandate around supply chains in the diocese. But we know that there are dioceses across the country that have to do the same thing. The other part of our mandate is to raise awareness at the local level, nationally and internationally. My boss is a former ambassador to the Holy See and an ex-QC, so his kind of connections on this issue in the global Catholic Church are quite huge, and what we're hoping is that anything that we do here can be a catalyst for Catholic supply chains around the world. Our mandate is also to build organizational capacity to address modern slavery. So, just amongst all kinds of Catholic organizations, like I said, there's 6,500 of them, for people to be able to understand and be able to respond in some way. And then obviously to advocate to the Australian government to improve the response. So that is our mandate in the diocese. And I think the leadership that's been shown by both the Pope and the Archbishop is pretty commendable. So just to give you I just want to give you a little bit of this background because I want you to see, I'm kind of an NGO person. I come from the NGO world and from a service delivery world and a world of, working with victims of trafficking directly. But I'm also now part of this enormous beast that needs to respond to the Modern Slavery Act. So although we had this mandate to work only in the Archdiocese of Sydney, we decided we should try to bring everyone from all those different entities together to look at how we could collaborate across the Catholic Church, across the country, really around the stuff that everyone's been talking about today, shared costs, shared resources, common suppliers, even just mapping and our entities and mapping suppliers, all that kind of stuff. And so we had a meeting at the end of July, and it was really the first ever, it was like world first meeting of the business operations of the Catholic Church, right? Not the charitable stuff, not all the great stuff that Catholic social justice organizations do around the world on modern slavery, but the business people. So procurement, general counsel, HR, all kinds of people that deliver that money to those entities that essentially is the business arm. So we didn't get everybody, but we got a lot of who I mentioned. And interesting because I think there were also some laggards who decided that they didn't think they needed to report, so they just didn't bother to come along. So hopefully they'll get on board soon. But yeah, I just wanted to share that although I'm sort of in this NGO role and still doing a lot of NGO kinds of things, is a huge part of our mandate here, and we also want to share and be a part of any kind of learning community that's out there with the corporate sector. So before I was at the Catholic Archdiocese, and I guess to say we're also faced with a lot of similar challenges. I'm on a steep learning curve because I usually talk to the social justice people, and now I have to talk to the CFO and the procurement person and general counsel. So it's really, really challenging. Before that, like I said, I was at the Salvation Army doing a lot of advocacy around getting the Modern Slavery Act to pass, along with many of you here in the room. And then before that, I co-founded Anti-Slavery Australia at the UTS Faculty of Law. And then before that, I used to do this work in the US. And so what I wanted to do is actually take you back a little bit to what started me in this space, because I didn't grow up deciding to do anti-slavery work. I have a background in the arts. Back in 1995, when I was still living in the United States, I woke up one morning along with many other Angelinos to find a pretty unbelievable story in the newspaper. So this is an ordinary-looking apartment complex on an ordinary street in an ordinary neighborhood in suburban Los Angeles called El Monte. It's about 20 minutes drive from where I lived, and actually my dad grew up in El Monte, and he went to El Monte High School. The news story said that 72 people from Thailand had been held captive in this apartment complex, some for several years, sewing clothes in a makeshift factory. That's the actual kind of living room where some of the sewing machines were set up. The passports had been taken by the factory owners. They had been monitored by armed guards. There were actually armed guards walking around the property, walking around on the roof. And they had slept in crowded bedrooms, which, again, sorry, these are old photos from, before the old iPhone days. And these are photos from the Department of Immigration who raided the factory. So the passports had been taken. They were being monitored by these armed guards. They slept in these bedrooms, 8 to 10 people to a room. It's kind of hard to see, but if you look at the kind of window area there in the corner, those are boards that have been put over the windows. And that was to prevent them from escaping. This is the El Monte Company store. So if you had been brought to the El Monte slave shop, you had to buy all your stuff from the company store. So whatever you needed, Your personal items, even food, you had to buy it from the company store. How much do you think a bar of soap cost in the El Monte company store? $20. Right. So they had to purchase their food, toiletries, and other items they needed from the company store at highly inflated prices. Most of the workers were in debt bondage to the owners or the recruiters that brought them over, and they were unable to work off their debts because they had these usurious contracts and were in this kind of debt situation. They worked all day, every day, making clothing for well-known retailers in the United States. And they had work contracts, but these contracts were just, completely usurious and set up to exploit them and put them in a situation where they could never work off the debt. This kind of became an iconic photo for the anti-slavery movement in the United States. So there was barbed wire around the property, and the neighbors kind of saw the barbed wire. The barbed wire was not facing outwards to keep people out, but was facing inwards to prevent the workers from escaping. In addition to the passports being withheld, the sweatshop owners would hold people's mail, censor people's mail, and the place was literally set up like a prison. So this is what Angelenos woke up to on that day in 1995. Again, this is an old photo of the workers who were liberated from the slave shop. And I think the look on one woman's face there says it all in terms of the fear and the confusion and, liberation, depending on how it's done and who does it, can be a really traumatic, terrifying experience. Instead of being provided care, support, and legal assistance, so this was back in 1995, before the US had its own anti-trafficking legislation, they were taken to immigration detention, which is jail, because when the immigration detention centers are full in the United States, they subcontract to jails. So they were all taken to jail. And if not for the efforts of the Thai community and a coalition of Asian and Latino workers' rights organizations, churches, and some strategic use of the media, they all would have been deported and forgotten. So at that time in America, there was no recognition of them as victims, no mechanisms to protect them, no remedies available to address their experiences of slavery, forced labor, and human trafficking. But it was a case that would lay the foundation for change and give rise to the American movement against human trafficking and slavery. And it was a case that changed people's thoughts, feelings, and opinions because of the gross violation of the victims' basic human rights and because of the long struggle for justice that followed. So, that's kind of, I don't have time to kind of go through the case in detail, but I wanted to also show you that, people did get remedy. It took a long time, and like I said, it was really hard, and I don't have the time to go through the whole thing. But in the end, there was a successful criminal prosecution of the factory owners using really old indentured servitude legislation, like in the US kind of criminal code. So there was a successful criminal prosecution of the factory owners. There was a successful settlement with the retailers that the workers were making the garments for. And the workers were able to stay in the United States and rebuild their lives. Some of them even set up a garment cooperative after this case that was, unionized and had childcare and living wage and all that. And there was the civil case did result in some changes to the way garment work was regulated in California. So it was kind of in the end, it's kind of fondly remembered as a model, that there were good remedies and model outcomes for the workers and for the government, and that the perpetrators were put in jail. So while many things have changed for the better in terms of how slavery victims in the United States and Australia and many countries can access remedies, it's still an incredible challenge to ensure that remedies can be accessed, that wrongs are righted, and that future harm is prevented. During the last 20 years, the supply chains of many businesses have become more multinational, multi-tiered, and the production of goods and services are taking place in more high-risk environments where workers experience vulnerability, rule of law is weak and insufficient in protecting workers' rights. So even in developed countries like Australia, there's structural, economic, and social factors that contribute to the exploitation or enslavement of people. Here, especially for migrants, new arrivals, and people on temporary visas. And I think we've touched on that a little bit today. In spite of these challenges, governments have an obligation to protect workers from human rights abuses by third parties, and that includes business entities. So together, governments and business entities have a shared responsibility to ensure that effective remedy is provided to those whose rights have been breached or abused. And that's just a slide from the UN Guiding Principles to show that, you know, this is all interrelated. So when we talk about remedy, we're talking about righting the wrongs, right? About doing everything that can be done to reverse the harms. In terms of what can be done when situations of modern slavery, like we've heard about, have surfaced, you know, these are some of the actions that might be taken. And we've heard a little bit about access to criminal justice remedies and civil remedies, and that's going to look different in every country. So most countries around the world now have signed, you know, and ratified international legislation on human trafficking and slavery, and most countries have some type of response. It's going to look different everywhere. And Australia has a response as well that I'll get into in a minute. And those civil remedies, whether that's, you know, going for wages or having, you know, a private lawsuit, that's going to look different in each jurisdiction. Obviously, people being able to have access to social services and support, I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer. When someone's escaped from slavery or been taken out of slavery, they need help straight away. Financial compensation is obviously a remedy, and I can tell you this is such an important remedy for people. And the sooner they can get any compensation, the better. And I've worked on a number of cases where getting compensation, and I'm not talking about huge sums of money, I'm just talking about some money fairly immediately, can really provide them immediate relief for themselves and their families. Help to find alternative employment. And for those of you that are engaged in this space, and I put it out there on LinkedIn, and I got one response. We're always looking for jobs for people who've experienced slavery. So if you're in a business where you might be willing to consider employing people, we'd love to hear from you. There might be collaborative interventions with civil society partners that could be delivered as part of remedy. And those can take many shapes and forms, so I'd really encourage you to reach out to civil society sooner rather than later. Acknowledgement and apology is really important. The Almonte workers, really 6, 7, 10 years later, I think their acknowledgement and apology from a whole host of people has been so important to their healing. And the Almonte slave shop case is actually now a part of the National Museum of American History. So there's actually a part of the museum that has been given over to the case. And then again, a demonstration of measures implemented within a business to prevent future occurrences, right? So understanding and doing something about it, like trying to figure out how you can prevent it in the future. So if suspected or actual victims of modern slavery are identified, safety and security from further harm or greater vulnerability to risk should be paramount. Business entities will be able to respond more effectively if there's a documented process or policy in place to guide the actions of staff in response to disclosures or when indicators surface. So NGOs that work in this space around the world, they have a documented process on how they handle when someone makes a referral to them. And I've been thinking, maybe this is a way to, maybe there's a way to kind of share that with business. I'm going to get kicked off. This is going to happen again. All right. Oh my gosh, I'm going to zip. How am I going to do this? So responding to disclosures will also vary to the geographical context and location of victims, especially if they're located in countries where the government response is underdeveloped or ineffective. And I think you really need to educate yourself about this in places that you've identified are high risk to you and your business. So it's important to to understand and be prepared to respond. Oh man, I am so over. Okay, well, let me just skip. Can I do 2 minutes? Is that okay? Is everyone going to stay for 2 minutes? Do you want to know what happens in Australia if you find modern slavery? Yes. Okay, Here we go. We'll get to that. So this is just, I can just read the guidance. The guidance has some tips on what to do around, what if you find it, and I think it's super vague. And hopefully it will be a little bit better. I'm going to give you the highlights of the government's response. Australia has a human trafficking team in every city that can investigate instances of modern slavery, okay? So we have specialist law enforcement who can assess whether or not they think the crimes in our criminal code have occurred. And you can contact them. You can contact them, you can build a relationship with them. They'll come and talk to you and explain to you what their role is. They assess cases, and if they think someone is a victim, they can refer them to something called the Support for Trafficked People program, which is administered by the Australian Red Cross, and that is a support service for victims. What that means, though, is that a potential victim has to come and speak to the AFP. So the AFP is the gateway to victim support, victim cooperation, and victims disclosing and putting themselves on the radar of law enforcement is the way that people can be supported. That's not a viable option for a lot of people, but it's really important that when the government is telling you, like, just refer to us, that you understand that there may be risk in the mind of the victim to doing that, and that there may be victims who are not going to want to access that framework. So the point of going to the AFP is to address the crime and to try to prosecute people. Along with the support, there may be temporary and permanent visas made available to victims. And as I said, the Red Cross can deliver support through the AFP. So you can't go to the Red Cross and say, can you help me? You have to go to the AFP, who then makes the referral to the Red Cross. The government also has a national roundtable on people trafficking and slavery. There's a national action plan, a 4-year plan that Australia has that's expired pretty much now. And the next 4 years are currently going to be drafted. And I think it's really important that business has input into that plan. And then DFAT is kind of highly engaged in the region with business. So those are sort of like the highlights of the government response. What I wanted to share with you was the lowlights. I have all these things, and then I will finish. Very few victims have been identified in spite of 15 years of work being done in this space, in spite of an actual action plan, in spite of human trafficking teams in the federal police. And there's never been any convictions in Australia related to supply chains. So there's been lots of, there's been convictions, I wouldn't say lots, well, there's been 23 convicted since 2004. The convictions have come in the areas of the sex industry, domestic workers, a couple of restaurant cases. So we have yet to have really a big case or any case involving supply chains. Very few permanent visas have been granted over the years, and the support program has never been evaluated, and clients of that program don't give any feedback. The National Action Plan, which sounds great that we have a National Action Plan, but it's basically unfunded. And it focuses more on outputs rather than outcomes. And the progress is very incremental. We heard a bit, and Robin was talking about resources in the UK, we just don't have that same commitment of resources, and we haven't for the last 15 years. So part of this is kind of an invitation to business as well. So you've got the Modern Slavery Act that you now have to comply with, and yet there's not a lot sitting behind it, and there needs to be a lot more business engagement in the stuff that would sit behind the Modern Slavery Act. So what I want to do is encourage you to get engaged with civil society and engage with some of the peak organizations that have been engaging with civil society to help us drive a better operational response that's going to help you to have more visibility and address these issues in your supply chains. Because while we have a lot of things that look good on paper, in practice, there are huge gaps and a lot that doesn't translate. And there is no hotline or helpline for business or anyone to call other than like 000 or Crime Stoppers. Or you can fill out a form on the Federal Police website to report an instance of modern slavery, and someone will get back to you in 30 days. So, I think there's just a lot of work to do there on the operational side. And when we talked about there not being an anti-slavery commissioner, the whole point of the anti-slavery commissioner was to start to really address these operational issues. So we need more advocacy and support. And I think there'll be an opportunity in a few years and an evidence base hopefully to, again, us to be able to advocate for the anti-slavery commissioner. And I'm sorry, I've totally blown my time. So look, anyway, I wanted to just, don't believe everything that you're told about how, you know, the operational response here is totally under control. It's incredibly challenging for people to access remedy. And we just need to work closer together, the NGOs and business, because that's actually how we got the Modern Slavery Act over the line. So anyway, I'm sorry I've run out of time. I had a lot more stuff to share, but.